Okay, so this is Dr. DeMaio. I do believe that we are recording right now, and this is Anatomy and Physiology, AHS 131, and I am going to be your teacher, as I said. This is a narrated version of your PowerPoint presentation that's already uploaded in Blackboard. I will send you a link for this in YouTube, and you'll be able to watch it anytime you want. I suggest that right now you take a moment, get some paper and a pen, and as I always teach my students, that you should print the notes out as notes pages, because when you print it out as notes pages, you have one slide on the top and then an open space on the bottom for some notes. I also suggest to store these PowerPoints printed out like that with extra notes in between, so you can keep all your notes in one place. This is the main part of your first lecture, and there will be another part coming shortly that talks about the development of the human body, starting out with the two cells forming one as a zygote, which is the original stem cell, and going through to cover the development of the human body as far as dermatome, myotome, and sclerotome. And you'll see that those are very important topics, because this semester we are going to learn, like this chapter 1 is Introduction to the Human Body, covers a lot of basic stuff. And then chapter 2, because this course requires chemistry in this classroom. In other words, you could get into this class without having chemistry, so we have to teach you the chemistry of the body. Chapter 2 is the chemistry of the body. Then chapter 3 is the cell. Chapter 4 is tissues. Now, once we're done with those first 4 chapters, as I usually tell my students, they are like boot camp. And once you're done with boot camp, then you can go into your specialization in the field. And many of you are going into different fields, but this is a specialization, as I'm talking about anatomy and physiology, is we're going to learn the first 4 chapters and own them. That's your first exam in the summer sessions. And your first exam will be after we do chapters 1 through 4, which is a lot of information. It is, like I said, your boot camp. I will be posting some quizzes in between to keep you on track. The quizzes are not graded as far as calculated as a percentage. You have to at least complete them or you get it incomplete. Also, you will see that chapters 1 through 4 talk about everything from the least level of organization, which is the chemistry level, all the way through to the tissue level. And we'll go through this. We'll learn a little bit more about what I'm talking about. This image you see on this first page are nice 3 images. I like them because we're going to come back and refer to these when we get into directional terminology on the left and directional terminology on the right. And in the middle is surface anatomy. Now, when we talk about surface anatomy, some of these things have been cut off. I can see that on this image. You have this image in your textbook as well. Now, surface anatomy is a great way to learn the basics, and actually what I suggest you do is when we do the directional terminology, we'll do it in the lab on Sunday, I'm going to have you get some sticky notes. So before the lab on Sunday, make sure you get some sticky notes, and you're going to cut them so that you can have small, tiny pieces of sticky notes that you can write on and have the sticky part at one end, and you could stick them on your body at the different areas to help you to learn it. And again, if you look in the center, it's not going to be the simple terms like forearm. We're looking at antebrachial. And not the front of the elbow, it's antecubital. Not the back of the elbow, it's olecranon or olecranon. So we're using the technical terms here for testing purposes, and that's what we want you to learn, the terminology, and it will help you as you progress through the courses of A&P1 and A&P2. So anatomy and physiology hasn't always been taught together. It used to be taught just anatomy and then a separate course on physiology, and then they started combining them. And because there's so much information, they made Anatomy 1 and A&P1 and A&P2. My contention for many years is that there should be a interphase type course. In other words, you have anatomy 1, everything up to and including the muscles, and then anatomy 2, interphase would be the nervous system and the endocrine system, and then anatomy 2 would start with the blood and go through all the other systems. And I feel like that would be a better use of our time, and you'd be able to learn it better, because this course, AMP1 or AHS 131, is about everything up to and including the nervous system. And it's almost impossible to do a real bang-up job on the nervous system in the short period of time that we have. So as you'll see as we go through the course, sometimes I put things in the early chapters that aren't really there yet. They're going to be there later on, preparing you for that. So as you're going through this course, you're learning those things and you're owning them by the time we get to it. And they're principles that are based upon how the nervous system and muscles work, and also a little bit about the endocrine system. They're basic principles that are found in basic cell biology, and we're going to feed it a little bit at a time, and you're going to own it. So when we say anatomy versus physiology, what I'm trying to tell you is that anatomy is the structure and physiology is the function. So if you went back to the first page, you can get these notes afterwards and go back to the first page if you want. You have the regular PowerPoint in your Blackboard. You can have that open anytime you want. But anatomy is structure. And then structure does dictate function. And so you need to know your anatomy before you understand how things work. It's just like a little kid. A little kid gets in one of those little swings, you know, the baby. They put him in one of those automatic swims that clicks back and forth, makes that clicking noise, and you give him like a rattle or fake keys, you know, plastic keys, and they're looking at it and then examining it and turning it in every direction, trying to understand it. And so you have to be able to identify, and then we have a nomenclature associated with that, and that has to do with terminology, and you're going to name those different parts. And then physiology has to do with function and how does it work. And you'll see the term physiology. You know, ologies, I don't know if you know that ology is from the Greek system of learning. That means the study of. And it's the study of the and when they say physiology, I think they wanted to combine biology with the word, and instead of putting the word biology in there, it's the study of the physics and of the biological systems, basically. And basically it looks at chemistry, biology, and utilizes physics to help explain how things work. For instance, blood pressure and heart rate and muscle contraction and movement and all these different things use physics. Okay, so living versus non-living, silly thing. I mean, we all know what something's living and non-living. We go through some basic things of understanding how things stay alive. Now, I always say this, first thing we should do is try to learn what it takes to stay alive and healthy, instead of learn about diseases first. And in order to understand what it takes to stay healthy and live, is you have to know what's normal. And how do you know what's normal if you can't name all the basic components and anatomical components? You know, imagine your mechanic looks at a carburetor or a fuel pump and doesn't know the basics of the engine, how it works. I mean, you can't know the basics without knowing the parts. So you have to know your anatomy, you have to know your physiology in order to understand how things stay healthy. And that's what our focus should be actually in healthcare, should be how do you stay healthy? What does it take to be healthy? And of course, knowing normal first is important and what it takes to keep that healthy. And the next thing is levels of organization, and all the textbooks do this. They start out, what are the basic levels of organization in the human body, starting out with the chemical level, the cellular level, the tissue level, the organ systems, and the organism. And then terminology is key, and we'll talk about terms. We'll learn different terms, and I might even upload a short little Word document associated with terminologies. And in the beginning of the human body, the first stem cell. What is the first stem cell? Do you know what it is? What's it called? You know, have you heard of stem cells? But what's the first stem cell in the human body? And then how does the body develop from there? We'll talk a little bit about that, I think, in our second part more. So I don't know, I was planning on putting in this, but there's 33 slides, so 34 slides here. And I felt like it would be best to break it up into another section. And this way we hit it better. Now, jump-starting your anatomy and physiology is a good thing. If you could jumpstart yourself and really kind of get a head start. I have a couple of students contacting me before the semester, always trying to get a jump start, finding out what they could do. That's good. That's a good sign. And of course, a good student would start reading their chapters before they come to class. You know, we'll talk about that this Saturday. And but jump-starting your anatomy and physiology may have to do with surface anatomy and terminology and some basic things of how the body works, some terms associated with that. And then the 3 divisions of the somite, we'll talk about that at the end. And the somite, if you've never heard of a somite, you're going to learn about it today. And the somite is key because after our boot camp, chapters 1 through 4, we start things that are associated with the somite. And the first one is the first system of the body is the integumentary system, which includes your skin, hair, nails, and glands, and accessory organs. And the skin is the largest organ in your body. It's part of a system called the integumentary system, and we'll learn about that. And that actually, skin has dermatomes, and so as your skin develops, dermatomes form. And so what is a dermatome? It's part of the 3 divisions of the somite, and we'll talk about that. And then we have the next system in the human body will be the osseous system that we'll study, which is the bones, the skeletal system. And there's a part of the somite called the sclerotome that has to do with the bones and all the connective tissues. And we'll see what that is. And then the next system we do here for this semester is the muscular system, spending most of our time in the skeletal muscle, and that is associated with a part of the somite called the myotome. Myology is the study of muscle. And then the last system in the body will be the nervous system. Now you'll see how these 3 divisions of the somite are intimate related to the nervous system. And it's associated with the development of the nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord. Very fascinating how our body is wired, and it's like a map. And then the body cavities. We have like these body cavities, like where your lungs are, where your heart is. There's cavities within the thoracic cavity. So you have a thoracic cavity with the right and left pleural cavities, and you have the pericardial cavity where the heart sits. And then you have the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is all the viscera are located. And we'll go over those body cavities. And then we will eventually go over the membranes. Probably in a lab time, we'll do more membranes. It depends on the time we have in this class and lecture. And then we'll actually look at these things on slides as well, those membranes, and understand that during this time, I'm recording this, we are in a lockdown basically because of a virus that is caused by respiratory droplets that hit a membrane. They hit your mucous membranes in your skin and in your mouth and your nose and your respiratory tract. And there are cells within those membranes that are very important for immunity. People don't realize that. And so when we look at these body cavities, we'll name all the membranes associated with them, understand them and how they function, and the cells associated, because we're moving into the lab on Sunday. We're actually going to start looking at some tissues, even though chapter 4 is tissues, but the way the course is set up, we spend some time in the beginning going over tissues. And that's just the way the course is. That's just the way it is. Lecture and lab don't always jive 100%. They work together most of the time, but there's a time we're spending more time on the bones, let's say naming each bone and the parts of the bone, and more time naming each muscle and associated with the muscles, whereas we're learning how the functions in lecture. So you'll see the course doesn't jive 100% between lecture and lab, but they will come together in the end. and then we'll talk about the foundational principles of physiology. Okay, so on the left side you have anatomy, on the right side you got physiology. Anatomy has to deal with structures. Physiology on the right has to deal with function, like I said before. On the left, anatomy involves identification, and we utilize this in our lab mostly. So anatomy, you could just basically say the lab is more anatomy and the lecture is more physiology. And it involves identification and helps in your communication, and communication is cash in your pocket. What do I mean by that? Well, if you're on the job and you're a nurse or a health practitioner and you're communicating back and forth to different people on the job and your boss sees that you really know your terminology and really know your anatomy, guess who he's going to move through to higher levels and positions? The one who knows how to communicate well and articulate these terms, or the one who says like elbow versus olecranon, or can understand things? I mean, it helps you to understand what the doctors are talking about and reading reports and so on. So you should never be afraid of terminology. It's actually fun. Words are fun, and we'll talk about that. And structure does dictate function. Another way of saying is form follows function, but structure dictates function. And you need to learn the structures. That's what anatomy is. That's what our lab is. Naming, nomenclature, name this. What is this? What's this? What's that? You know, if you had a little kid, I don't know if you ever did this with a little kid, you know, like a toddler, and you put them in their arms and you walk around the house and they point before they could talk and say, what's this? What's this? And you're teaching them terminology, light switch or telephone. I mean, so you teach kids how to talk. They're learning the names of things. And that's what this is, learning the structures and the names. It's really, it's basic, but for some people it's more difficult, especially if you don't come from a Latin background or a European background, because a lot of the terms have a Latin or Greek prefixes and suffixes. If you're Asian, it's a little more difficult to try and understand the terminology, but you will get it. It's about memorization. And then you're going to learn all these components of this wonderful machine before understanding its function. So physiology on the right, how does it work? Know what gives life to the body before understanding disease. That makes sense. Physiology involves chemistry. Knowing the chemistry of the body is key to understanding physiology. So when I say physiology involves chemistry, do you have to do chemical equations? No, not really. Maybe later on and when you're dealing stuff with the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, but not this semester. There'll be no chemical formulas you have to really, balance equations or anything like that. But knowing the general chemistry of the body, meaning when I say general chemistry of the body, that includes biochemistry, organic chemistry, and inorganic chemistry. So it's all in chapter 2, by the way. Physiology involves physics. Understanding some basic physics helps to understand how chemistry and structures interact. Look, I'm not a physicist, but there are things that are just common sense for some people who are mechanical and they can understand it. And then on paper, you can read and understand a little more about the physics of things. And so it doesn't bring much physics into the topic, but it's utilizing physics when you're trying to understand it. So in a textbook like this is what I suggest. You don't read this textbook like a novel. When you read novels, just kind of flow through it. These textbooks are technical, so when you're reading and it says go to figure 5-2, you stop. You go to figure 5-2 and you try to understand it, and you read it and you try to understand what's going on there. And then you go back. I also recommend outlining the chapters before you come to class, and at least having some questions in the back of the mind before you even come to the class. And this way it will help you to understand it better. And physiology has to do with how chemistry and physics explain function. We talked about this already. So cellular physiology is key to understand human function, since the cell is the basic structural functional unit of the human body. System physiology studies the different systems, such as the cardiovascular system, the integumentary system, the osseous system, the musculoskeletal system, and so on. Pathophysiology studies the physiology of disease, and there are different special physiologies such as aerospace physiology or exercise physiology. There's so many different specialties that people can go into. Now, living versus dead. Living organisms must survive, and they have this ability to detect and respond to changes in their environment. An inanimate rock does not detect and make changes according to its environment. It's at the will of its environment. It can wear out, it can whatever. But animals or biological creatures such as humans have the ability to detect changes through special senses, our body wall senses, our internal senses, and we can detect things through receptors, and we can respond to those changes in our external environment and our internal environment. And then after reproduction, we must grow and differentiate. Cells grow and differentiate. They change from one type of cell to another as we develop in the womb. It's amazing how we have this thing called differentiation. And we'll talk about that in our next PowerPoint presentation that I'll be planning for you. And we can both move externally and internally, living creatures. Now, people can argue the point that our stone has vibrations. Yes, it does. It has vibrations. Just about everything has vibrations, and I understand in the universe. I'm not an expert in that area, but I do know that a stone is not going to start creeping towards a bug, or something to eat. It's not going to do that. So we have the ability to move externally. And then internally, it doesn't have a digestive system and a metabolism. So that's our next topic, is that living organisms have what's called a metabolism. And to define the word metabolism, it's the sum total of all the chemical reactions within the body. Whoa, hold on a second. So chemistry is the simplest level of organization, the first level. And so chemistry is very important. And then metabolism is defined as the sum total of all chemical reactions in the body. And did you know that every chemical reaction in your body requires enzymes? Every single one. Okay, so metabolism is the sum total of all the chemical reactions within the body. And every chemical reaction requires enzymes. So what is an enzyme? Anybody know? Think about it for a minute. Enzymes are made up of globular proteins. And a globular protein has usually more than one protein combined together with bonds to either a mineral or a vitamin. And the basic components of an enzyme are, take notes, is the apozyme, A-P-O-Z-Y-M-E. The apozyme is the protein portion. That's the globular protein portion. Then it has either a cofactor, which is a mineral, or a coenzyme, which would be a vitamin. Now that cofactor or coenzyme helps to make the shape of that globular protein, and the shape is extremely important for function. And here again, we have this term, structure dictates function. It can't be any more truer than with enzymes. If you change the shape of an enzyme, it will not work. And so enzymes are important for every metabolic reaction in our body. Every chemical reaction in our body requires enzymes. Why? Why is that? Why does our body and every chemical reaction in our body require enzymes? The answer is based upon our body temperature and the fact that we are made up of, and we have to break down, lipids, proteins, carbohydrates. Now, what is a lipid? It's a fat. So let's think back. Have you ever painted? If you've painted with watercolors, the brush cleans off with just cold water. No need to have any kind of turpentine or anything like that. If you painted with an oil paint, you'd have to have some sort of solvent. We call it a solvent, but a solvent is usually anything that is the fluid portion of a solution. But a solvent, when we talk about painting and oil painting, has chemicals that actually break down the oils in the paint. And so we could not drink solvent, that kind of solvent, turpentine, that would kill us, right? So how would we break down the fats at a temperature of only under our tongue, 98.6, under our armpit, 97 to 98, and inside deep into the core of our body, at the highest temperature and normal temperature in the core of our body is 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You would never break down a brush with just water at 100 degrees temperature like that has oil paint. It won't do it. You need something stronger. So the human body has enzymes to help catalyze chemical reactions. So enzymes are catalysts. And we'll learn more about what a catalyst is when we get into chemistry, chapter 2. But a catalyst can lower the energy of activation to allow the reaction to go at a lower temperature. And so it allows reactions that would break down fats, proteins, and carbs. It allows it to go at a very low temperature because it's using enzymes. And the enzymes will not enter into the reaction to the point where they'll become part of the product. They'll enter in the center, and they could be reused again. Now, enzymes are very susceptible to damage. Okay, so how do we make sure that our metabolism is functioning for life rather than towards disease and death? Is to make sure that we have all the basic components to keep it healthy. And all the structures are there, so you get an examination by a doctor and he checks everything. Everything seems to be there in order, seems to be functional well, and then your responsibility is to give the body what it needs to keep healthy. And if you're not getting enough of the building blocks to make enzymes, you won't have a good metabolism, will you? Because metabolism is the sum total of what? All the chemical reactions of the body, and every chemical reaction in the body requires enzymes. So it would be good to know what it makes up an enzyme. It's made up of amino acids and minerals or vitamins. So what is an amino acid? Amino acids are the building blocks for proteins. And there are over 20 found in life, but there are 9 that are essential. Okay, so let's look at that. So amino acids, 20 found in nature. Some books say 22. Just stick to the simple 20. And 9, some books said 8. So they used to say 10. Now everyone's talking about 9 essential amino acids. It shows you on a list here the leucine, isoleucine, valine, histidine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine. Those are all amino acids. They're all building blocks for proteins, but they are essential. Why? Because you must consume them in your diet, or else you will not have normal function in your body eventually. You must intake those essential amino acids to build all the different components of your body, not just enzymes. Neurotransmitters are actually made from amino acids, believe it or not. And if you look on here to the right, the non-essential amino acids are alanine, arginine, asparagine, aspartic acid, cysteine, glutamic acid, and glutamic acid is also known as, it's actually a neurotransmitter, believe it or not. It's the most common excitatory neurotransmitter in the central nervous system, which is crazy, right? Amino acids have many different roles, and proteins are very important in the cell membrane. Your receptors are made out of protein. Your antibodies are made out of proteins. Your insulin is a protein that if it's not shaped properly, it won't work, and those people need insulin. Tyrosine, you see there, that's an essential component to make melanin, and also it's essential for thyroid hormones, the ones that we think of, T3 and T4. So we have so many different functions of proteins and amino acids, and if you're not taking them in your diet, you cannot be healthy. And if you're not taking the 9 essential in your diet, we got some problems, don't we? Because you cannot be healthy. Because with the non-essential, you can convert one into another. You can synthesize them. But with the essential amino acids, you can't make them. It's kind of like vitamin C. Human beings can't make their own vitamin C. They must take it in their diet. Whereas vitamin D we produce if we get sunlight, right? So, and by the way, vitamin D is extremely important for your health, right? But it's really not a vitamin. It's really made by your body. So the levels of organization, here it is. We have chemical level is the simplest level, the cellular level, tissue level, organ, and then organ systems. Now, when we look at the chemical level, atoms are the basic building blocks for ordinary matter. They're very tiny, extremely tiny, much smaller than a virus, and viruses are pretty small. And viruses can actually live within the tiny cells. Atoms are the building blocks for everything that we know in space and everything around us. It's what makes up matter. If you looked at the periodic elemental chart, in chemistry is showing you all the different elements, and they're made up of atoms of the same element. And everything is made from atoms, the building blocks for all ordinary matter. Now we have this silly breakdown to bio versus supermolecules. A biomolecule just is saying that substances that are produced by cells. A supermolecule is two or more molecules. So cells give off CO2. That would be like a biomolecule, right? And supermolecules would be more like glucose, because glucose is made from two sugars. So the basic structural functional unit of the body is the cell, and the cell membrane has been known or called the semi-permeable phospholipid bilayer. What does that mean? Semi-permeable phospholipid bilayer. It means it's allowed things to pass through. It's semi-permeable, not allowing anything, but some things can pass through. And that's a big topic in physiology of the cell. We need to understand how things get in and out of the cell. So it's semi-permeable. It's made up of two layers of phospholipids with many proteins floating in them, and they're very important to function. There may be other lipids such as cholesterol in there and other types of lipids, and carbohydrates will be in that membrane, lodged in there. So that's why they call it a fluid mosaic model. It's actually fluid, and when you look at this, we'll look in chapter 2, we'll see how the phospholipid membrane is extremely flexible to the point where you can insert something into the cell through the membrane and come back and will seal itself. And the phospholipid heads of the phospholipids flip position up to 10 million times per second. Yeah, 10 million times per second that the phospholipid heads flip position. So it's very dynamic, our cell membrane. It's kind of weird. And then organelles, you're going to have membranous and non-membranous, but the membranous organelles that are being shown here, like the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria, are all tiny little organelles within the cell. The tissue level, tissues make up organs and other body parts. There are four main types of tissue: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous tissue. Each is made of specialized cells that are grouped together according to structure and function. When we talk about epithelial, it's the covering and lining tissue. And I just gave you three basic types: squamous, cuboidal, and columnar. It has to do with the shape, but there's more to it. And then connective tissue includes things like your fascia, which is right underneath the skin and covering your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments, your cartilage, and bone. And believe it or not, even blood is a liquid connective tissue. Muscles, there's three types of muscles in the human body: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. This course will discuss mostly skeletal muscle this course, whereas in A&P2 you'll talk more about cardiac muscle and smooth muscle. And then the last one is the nervous system, which has two basic types of cells: neurons and neuroglia. And neurons are the structural functional unit of the nervous system. Okay, so We are talking about the levels of organization, and organ level. Organ is a structure that's composed of at least two different types of tissue cells, and they perform specific function within the body. Examples include things like the brain, the stomach, and the liver, and it is the sum total of all structural levels working together. That's basically what an organ is. I'm sorry, let's go back. An organ system is the sum total of all that. An organ is a separate organ, and many organs can be in a system, and the organ system is the sum total of all the organs working together. So that's a typo in there. Organism level. The organism level is the highest level of organization, and the organism is a living being that has cellular structure that can independently perform all physiological functions necessary for life. And you see on this chart, you can see the different levels of organization with the organism at the bottom, the human being. Now let's talk about this very important topic in physiology called homeostasis, and that refers to the stability, balance, or equilibrium within a cell or the body. So the cell has to be at homeostasis, each system has to be at homeostasis, and the entire organism must be at homeostasis. And what is homeostasis? It's stability. It can be thought of as the dynamic equilibrium rather than a constant unchanging state, meaning that your body will have systems to help to correct changes. For instance, like your blood pressure is constantly fluctuating. And so to simplify what homeostasis is, it's health or systems balance. And the nervous and endocrine systems are the two most powerful systems to help regulate homeostasis. Feedback mechanisms have three major components. So homeostasis is regulated by feedback mechanisms. And every feedback mechanism basically has three components. It has the receptor, the control center, and the effector. And there are many types of receptors in the body, such as ones that pick up temperature, thermoreceptors, the ones that pick up changes in things like CO2 and oxygen. Those are chemoreceptors. And then you have photoreceptors picking up light, mechanoreceptors picking up movement and touch, and taste receptors, and we have smell receptors, olfactory, gustatory receptors for taste. So we have these different types of receptors associated with the nerves. They're always connected to a nerve, for a sensory nerve. So the receptor sends the information to the control center. The control center is the processing center. And many times it will be the central nervous system, but not for all feedback mechanisms. For example, even blood cell production in the control center is the kidney, believe it or not. But many are the central nervous system. And then the third part is the effector. So once the control center processes that information, it will send it out to the effectors. The effectors make the changes needed for the desired correction or result. Sometimes you need to sweat to cool the body. Sometimes you need muscles to contract and shiver to warm the body. Sometimes you need muscles to tighten up in the blood vessels to constrict blood flow to increase pressure. Sometimes you need the heart rate to increase. There's so many different things that need to be done to regulate our body's function. And so feedback mechanisms start with a stimulus. And then you respond either through negative feedback or positive feedback. Now, when you hear the word negative, it's not bad. And you hear the word positive, it doesn't just mean it's the only good. They're both good. So negative feedback just is defining that when the stimulus comes in and is detected by the receptor, you have to, in order to restore balance, it will trigger the effectors to do the opposite of the stimulus. So for instance, if the stimulus was heat and it was too hot in the room, the effectors would have to cool the body, right? If the stimulus was high blood pressure, the effectors would have to lower the blood pressure. You get the picture? So the stimulus is detected. Example one is thermal regulation. You go into we talked about a hot room. What if you go into a cold room? or whatever, your body has to do the opposite. So the outcome is the opposite of the stimulus. On positive feedback, the stimulus that's being detected by the receptor causes the effector to enhance the original stimulus and make it even stronger. So for instance, in childbirth and the uterine contractions in prodome labor are starting to contract, and the baby's head is being moved down towards the cervix. As they contract more and more, it actually pushes down to the cervix, and the cervix, in the wall of the cervix, there are actually receptors in the wall of the cervix that are mechanoreceptors that can detect the stretch. They send a message to the brain, and then the brain releases a hormone that causes more severe contractions and also loosens up the pelvic outlet. And so that's one good example of positive feedback. So the baby's coming down. Come on down. Come on, baby. Come on, come on, come on, come on, baby. Come on. And then you catch them with a catcher's mitt. And blood clotting is also an example of positive feedback, that one thing leads to another and it triggers a cascade of steps to cause the blood to clot. Okay, now, what if you were trapped in a walk-in freezer? God forbid. What happens to your body? Your body senses the cold through receptors. Now, the receptor for cold or heat are called thermoreceptors. They're nerve receptors detecting temperature. And then the control center in this case is going to be the hypothalamus of the brain, in the center of the brain. The hypothalamus of the brain integrates the information. And by the way, you should know this on a test, that the hypothalamus is also the control center for the autonomic nervous system, otherwise known as the ANS. So in this case, the hypothalamus is going to cause the release of a hormone, and that hormone is called oxytocin. And then it's going to send it out to, not oxytocin is associated with childbirth, excuse me. In this case, the hypothalamus is going to integrate the information. It's going to send it out to the entire skeletal muscular system and your rectopili muscles of the hairs on your skin. That causes goosebumps, the hairs, and contraction of the skeletal muscle in shivering, uncontrolled shivering, produces heat, and that helps to heat your body. Okay. In childbirth, here we go. Okay. The baby's head is descending down to the os of the cervix, that's the opening, and the receptors in the cervix are lined. The cervix is lined with specialized nerve receptors, which are mechanoreceptors or stretch receptors. The baby's head begins to stretch the cervix, and then the control center detects that. In this case, the control center again is the hypothalamus of the brain. It receives that input via the nerves, and this becomes processed, and it causes the release of a hormone called oxytocin. Oxytocin causes stronger uterine contractions, more forceful and more frequent, pushing the baby out. And oxytocin also loosens up all your joints, including the pubic symphysis, opening up the pelvic outlet a little more so the baby could pass through better. You've heard of Pitocin, right? Well, that's a synthetic oxytocin to try and mimic what oxytocin does. Alrighty, moving right along. Now here again, stress adaptation principle simplified, or the general adaptation syndrome. Stress comes in many forms. That's the first thing you have to realize. Usually when I say the word stress, people usually conjure up in their mind emotional or mental stress, but stress can be physical, and many types of physical. What about trauma? What about sitting improperly or sitting for long periods of time? What about repetitive motion, sleep problem, positions on the job? So you can have many types of physical stress on your body. How about chemical stress? Environmental chemicals, internal chemicals, foods, chemical exposures. There's all different types of chemical, or lack of having the right chemicals in your body. When we talked about enzymes, if you don't have those 9 essential amino acids, you're going to have a chemical stress in your body. So your diet can literally throw off your whole body system. Mental, of course, emotional, but then there's also thermal. You heard when you were a little kid, better put your boots on, it's raining out, or you better put your jacket on, put your hood on, because temperature drop could lower your ability to fight off infection and give you a chill and cause problems. Or too much heat could cause heat exhaustion, right? And you could actually have serious problems with dehydration and so on. You know, and when we talk about chemicals, the number one chemical is water. You got to make sure you're drinking enough water, right? So when stress overcomes your ability to restore homeostasis, it creates dysfunction. If any of those things were overwhelming, physical stresses, chemical stresses, mental, emotional, and even thermal, were too much, and you weren't able to protect yourself or adapt or fill in the gaps or whatever, and it becomes too much, like you're in the ocean and the waves just keep coming and coming and coming to the point they overtake you, it's going to lead to dysfunction. And the dysfunction leads to damage to cells and tissues. Once the damage to cells and tissues are there, it has to be there enough in order to create objective signs in medicine. And so the blood test may not show up right away, or the x-ray may not show up right away, or the stress test, ultrasound may not show things right away until there's enough damage that it shows these objective signs. And objective signs usually are measurable. And then the subjective symptoms come after. Think about it. Am I lying? No. What about heart disease? The most studied disease in the world. How many years? 40 years of studies? More than that? Anyhow, you study cardiovascular disease, and we know that a plaque takes years to build up usually. And that plaque is not recognized on any kind of objective test until it becomes a serious problem usually. Because a person really won't have the symptoms until it's really late. What's the first sign of heart disease? Usually a heart attack or angina, chest pain, which means the heart is not functioning right for a long period of time. It can't keep up, and then it gets damaged. And the damage causes damage to the tissues of the heart, and then you could pick it up on an EKG or what have you. So a lot of times people didn't even know they had damage in their heart, and they didn't have symptoms. So sometimes the symptom is the last thing that come along. And at that point, the disease has really started to take its toll on you. So you actually have dysfunction way before the symptoms or the disease is diagnosed. And that's why it's very important to make sure you keep your body functioning at its best. Give it all the things it needs so that you don't have those stresses overwhelming you physically, chemically, and mental, emotional, and thermal. So when you come up with a diagnosis in medicine, you have to have signs and symptoms to get a diagnosis. There's only one field in medicine that doesn't need signs, and that's psychology, because it's based on how the person feels. And so a sign is objective. It's something you can measure. Blood pressure, pulse, imaging, x-ray, MRI, CAT scan, blood test, biopsies. These are all signs that you can see there's something wrong. It's an objective, measurable sign. A symptom is subjective. It's how the patient feels. And you can have good days and bad days. You can have a problem that's really bad and you didn't even know it. Or you can have no problems and have a symptom, and there may be no signs associated with it yet, because it just hasn't showed up the sign. That could happen too. Treatment is dependent upon working diagnosis. Now, anytime you want to correct a problem, first of all, you have to know what's normal. And how do you come up with a diagnosis? You have to know what's normal first and the balances. Like, for instance, blood pressure. Everyone knows normal blood pressure is a mean average of healthy individuals. It was a study done on thousands of people, and they found that 120/80 was the mean average, 140/90 was the high average, and 90/60 was the low average. Anywhere in between there is a healthy individual. So that's just one example that if the blood pressure is out of balance, then you can come up with a treatment plan. And superior knowledge of terminology create good decisions in patient stabilization and care. What do I mean by that? If you're in the field or in the ER or whatever, and you don't understand certain things, and you don't know certain terms, it's going to be hard for you to really take care of that patient. So terminology, extremely important in healthcare. So this is where AMP1 shines, getting your basic terminology. And then also, Terminology helps you with communication with other health professionals, and it requires proper terminology so they know exactly what you're talking about. You want to find something, you have directional terminology like superior, inferior, lateral, medial. We'll go over that. And anatomical position is the basis for all terminology in human beings. In other words, we come to the plate when we deal with human beings that we all know. Every time you're talking about something as far as directions on a human body, where you're at on the body, we base it upon anatomical position. And that's the patient facing you with the palms up or thumbs out at the side. Let's see. So here you see the person facing you, or from the back, he's still in the same position, but we assume anatomical position. So notice how the thumb is out. That's on the outside, not on the inside. That's not a normal way we stand, but that's anatomical position. That's our basis for using terms for directions and so on and so forth. So surface anatomy has to do with naming the different areas of the body. And notice the words in the boldface are going to be important. And then when we look at the terms where you see some in a bracket, like look at carpal in the middle there, that means wrist, but we're not going to use the word wrist on a test. You'll use the word carpal. So I want you to know the proper terms of all these spots. So I suggest you do, and we're going to do this in a lab. As I said, you get sticky notes, you cut them into small, thin slices so you can write the words. Write all the words on a sticky note. Make sure it has a sticky end on each one of them. And then stick them on yourself or a family member to help you study. And you'll learn it so much better. Making a list like that first of all these terms, like inguinal versus groin, right? Occipital versus back of the head. Femoral versus the thigh, right? We want femoral. That's what you're going to put on the sticker, not thigh. And you're going to place it on the thigh, right? Okay, so I want you to do that for your lab, and it helps. This is a big help for you. Okay, in anatomical terminology, anatomical position stands for all directional terminology. Now, on the first page of the slide, I can't go back because I'm recording this. And if you go back to the first page of our slides, it shows you the anatomical position and the directional term. We'll go over that when we're live tomorrow, Saturday, and we'll be doing this in the lab as well, okay? So body cavities, we have body cavities, like the torso and the skull. Now notice we have a ventral side, which is the front or anterior. And then you have a dorsal side, which is the back or posterior, right? So look to the left is on the lateral view. It's a side view of a person, lateral view. You see the dorsal body cavity identified all the way to the left, and that is the cranial cavity and the vertebral cavity. Now I'll explain that in a moment, why that's dorsal. And then on the right side of that first image there on the lateral view, you see the thoracic cavity. And then you see it's separated by the diaphragm. And then you have this thing called the abdominal pelvic cavity. And actually, if you look to the right, it says abdominal pelvic cavity. And so there is an abdominal cavity, there is a pelvic cavity, but there's no membrane separating them. So that's why they call it the abdominal pelvic cavity, whereas the thoracic cavity has a membrane separating it from the abdominal cavity. And that's the diaphragm. Now looking to the right, you can see within the thoracic cavity above, you see the two purple structures there. You have the right and left pleural cavities. That's where the lungs are. And then where the green structure is in the center, that's the pericardial cavity. That's where the heart is. There is a space in between that allows blood vessels and pipes to pass through, so to speak. And that is called the mediastinum, which is not really a cavity. It's within the thoracic cavity, but it doesn't have a separate membrane surrounding it. Now, each of these body cavities we're talking about here, the cranial cavity, the vertebral cavity, part of the dorsal body cavity, and the thoracic cavity, the right and left pleural, and the pericardial cavity, and the abdominal pelvic cavity have a membrane surrounding them. And we'll talk about that. But let's talk about this dorsal body cavity, because if you look on the right view, the anterior view, you see the cranial cavity like in the forehead. That's in the front. Why are they calling it a dorsal body cavity? And that is because if you think of a four-legged creature, four-legged creatures are on hands and legs, right? And the head is up. And as the head is up, it's more dorsal with the back. And that's how they came up with the dorsal body cavity with that. And notice the brain is sitting inside that cavity and it runs down through the spine. It's all connected. You realize that if you took the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves out of the body, they're all connected. It's like if you're going to plant a bulb in the garden and then it grows into a tree, and you grab the bulb from the bottom and took the whole tree. That's the brain, spinal cord, and all those nerves. But the spinal cord would be like the main stem of the tree, you know, the log that you would chop down, you know. The branches would be all the nerves coming out from there. And we're going to go through that stuff. So now when we look at the abdominal pelvic cavity, in medicine, in triage, they use the right upper quadrant, right lower quadrant, left upper quadrant, left lower quadrant. A person comes in, I got pain over here, and they point to the right upper quadrant, and you'll write in your notes, right upper quadrant pain. And we know from diagnosis it could be a whole host of things, including gallbladder and liver problems, right? If you got left upper quadrant, it could be a whole host of things, and it could be associated with the spleen or stomach or pancreas. And then when you look at the right lower quadrant, we know it could be associated with the appendix, or the left lower quadrant could be associated with the intestines, and so on and so forth. So that's a quick way to triage a patient, but in anatomy, we take it a little step further. In anatomy, we have the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. Each one of them has a specific name, and if you look in the right hypochondriac, that's on the left of this picture because it's the patient's right? We're assuming anatomical position, the patient is facing you. So the right hypochondriac, and then you see the left hypochondriac on the opposite side. The word hypochondriac means below the costochondral junction. What do I mean by that? Your ribs are 12 ribs. The lower ribs and everything come around to the front, and there's a cartilage that connects it to the sternum. And that's called chondro, is the prefix for chondrocyte, which means cartilage cells. And that's called the chondrocostral region. So it's hypo, it's below the chondrocostal region. So notice this is below the diaphragm. It's hard to tell here on this image, but the diaphragm is going up around 1 and 3, kind of like an umbrella. Think of it like an umbrella. And that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity. So the right hypochondriac does not have the lungs. The lungs are above the diaphragm. And the diaphragm works in breathing, right? So on the right side, you need to know what is found in there. Liver, gallbladder, kidney on the right, small intestine. You see the left hypochondriac has a spleen, colon, left kidney, and the pancreas. Then you have the epigastric. Now, epi is a prefix for over, at, or upon. Over, at, or upon means right on top, like the epicenter of an earthquake. So gastric is stomach. So the epigastric is right over the stomach. And of course, you have portions of the liver, pancreas below, duodenum, spleen can be big enough to go into that area sometimes, adrenal glands. Then just below that, where your navel is, your belly button, is the umbilical region. That's easy. And that has the umbilicus, parts of the small intestine, the duodenum. Straight, but down below is the hypogastric. That means way below the stomach, sometimes called the pubic. And you have the urinary bladder, sigmoid colon, female reproductive organs. Number 4 and number 6 are the lumbar regions. That's where the lumbar spine is, the level of the lumbar spine below the ribs. And on the right is the right lumbar, and it would have those organs, the gallbladder, liver, colon. And on the left would have the descending colon and the left kidney. And then you have the right and left iliac, sometimes called inguinal. And the right iliac may have the appendix, the cecum. The left iliac may have the descending colon and the sigmoid colon. Now these lines, tic-tac-toe grid, are important. Now I call it the tic-tac-toe grid, but if you look at it as a tic-tac-toe grid, if you went back to the other image, you would see you have two lines going down the middle and two lines going across. Now this shows different names of those lines going down the middle, straight up and down, the longitudinal ones. The one that's right in the middle of the clavicle, I call the mid-clavicular line. They're calling it the mammary line. Mid-clavicular or mammary is fine. And then you have two of them, one on either side. So that separates that. And then going across transversely or horizontally is the transpyloric line or plane. That transpyloric line is always going to go through the pyloric region of the stomach. That's where the stomach empties into the duodenum. And then the transtubercular line, that's always going to go through the tubercles of the pelvis. It's like a big bump at the top of the ilia. So that's how you know you put the grid in the right spot. And if I could write a software, I would write a software. You have to practice doing that. Okay, and this is body movements. This is a good thing to get up and stand up as I do this, and you can stand up and watch it and do it. So if you look, let's look at the bottom first because it's easier. The bottom left, when you flex your knee, that's flexion. See how they bring the heel towards the buttocks? When you extend it, it straightens it out. When you take your foot all the way to the right, it says dorsiflexion, bring your toes up and bring your foot up and walk like a duck. That's dorsiflexion of the foot. When you walk on your tippy toes, that's plantar flexion. When you look, let's not worry about inversion or eversion yet or circumduction there in the bottom. Let's go up the second row in the middle. You have flexion and extension of the wrist, flexion and extension of the arm at the elbow, and straight up all the way to the top, flexion and extension of the shoulder. And then you have all the way to the right, flexion and extension of the head and neck. So if I was in class with you, I would demonstrate that flexion is kind of like crawling up in a ball in a corner when there's an incoming bomb coming in and you're like crawling in a corner and you want to die. You cry, incoming! You know, you would bring your knees to your chest, hands over your head, and you're flexing your shoulder, flexing your elbow, flexing your wrist, flexing your fingers around your head, flexing your torso, hip flexion of your hip, flexing your knee, and curled up in a fetal position in the wall, in the corner of the room. That's flexion. Extension is the opposite, opening everything up. And so when you look at the middle row there, where it shows the hand flipping left and right, that's pronation. Is like when you're playing that game where you put your hands under someone's hands and you're going to slap them above, turn your hand so you face your hand straight down on the table. That's pronation. You turn it out like you're serving the soup. That's supination. Okay, and then you look just directly above that image of the hands. You see elevation and depression. The scapula elevate up and they depress back down. The jaw can depress down too. And so just below the hands to the right, the jaw can also protrude or project. You jut your jaw forward, and that is protrusion of the jaw, and bringing it back is retrusion or retraction. And the scapula can do that too, protract and retract. Kind of like a tape measure. If you take the tape measure, you pull it out. They're calling this protrusion. It's usually called protraction, where the jaw gets jutted forward or the scapula goes forward. And then retraction is bringing it back into place and bringing the scapula back. Like you pinch your shoulder blades back. That's retraction, right? And then if you look in the middle, down at the bottom, you see the foot inversion versus eversion. And it's very clear that bringing your toes up the middle in the midline is inversion and pushing them outward is eversion. And then if you look all the way to the top left, they're demonstrating abduction of the arms and legs. So her right arm, which is on the left side of her, as you look at her, is being abducted, and so is her leg, meaning being pulled away. If you were going to abduct somebody, you would take them away from the body. Adduction is bringing it back to the midline. And then you can rotate the shoulder and the hip medially or internally, and laterally or externally. And then the head and neck can rotate. They don't show here. Rotating left and right is rotation of the head and neck. And you can do a thing called circumduction. Now they're showing it. It's hard to explain it, but if you take your arm and swing it around like a circle over your head, like you had a lasso and you're swinging it over your head, that's circumduction. It basically combines all those actions together. So we're going to talk about the somite in our lecture on Saturday a little more, and I'll have more notes uploaded that day as well. The somite is actually in the development of the human body. We'll talk about how it gets to the point of a somite, but the somite has three parts: dermatome, myotome, and sclerotome. This is in a developing baby, in the fetus, and this is before the brain fully develops. You have these dermatome, myotomes, and sclerotome of the somite lining up all around the spine, the brain, and spinal cord, and then it forms out to grow out. So a dermatome, the definition, this is what I want you to write down. How do you define a dermatome? And you'll see all three of them start out with this word, the spinal nerve. All three definitions start out with the spinal nerve and its blank that it supplies. So a dermatome, what do you think it is? It has to do with skin, right? So the dermatome is the spinal nerve and the skin it supplies. A myotome is the spinal nerve and the muscle it supplies. And a sclerotome is the spinal nerve and the bone it supplies. So we'll talk about this more when we meet on Saturday. Okay, and I hope you outline your chapter before I get into class, and if you have questions for me, I'm ready for them. In the beginning of Saturday's Zoom, we're going to go over the syllabus first. Okay, take care. Bye.